We're going to tackle a big one today. You ready?
Yes.
No, are you ready?
Maybe. What are
Rules.
we doing? Rules. Ugh.
Rules. Rule creation. Like, boards wanting to come up with a rule for everything, like not allowing sneezing because it disrupted someone's sleep the other night.
I would say that comes in more as a homeowner request than from the board.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Noise complaints.
But let's talk about rules though. I think one of our earlier videos we talked about board's responsibility was to make policy, right?
Yeah.
So here we go. So let's talk about how they can be more careful with making policy. I think the first thing that boards need to understand, right, is those hierarchy of governing documents. And
it's a big one.
Yeah, you can't make a rule that conflicts
with your declaration,
right? Like a big example being renting, right? Like every board
Huge
wants
one.
to. Yeah, can we just eliminate renting? And no, because your declarations, which is up here, says you can't.
And rental caps too.
Right.
What's written in your declaration, you got to go by. You can't.
Right.
Just because you wrote it's capped at 1 in your rules and regulations, but your declaration says 3.
Yep.
You got to go by 3. You can't go by 1.
You got to go by 3. So I think the first step when you're looking at rules is understanding, can we actually make this rule?
Yep.
Right. And that's the first thing to look at is those hierarchy of documents. So one of the things I always like to tell a board is just answer a few questions to yourself, right? So you want to create a rule because you got a complaint about whatever it might be. A lot of times those are really subjective, right? And those are the difficult ones to create a policy for. But I always like to say just ask yourself a few questions. And I think the first question you should ask is it consistent with your documents and the hierarchy like we just talked about? But the second thing is, can you actually regulate it? Like, does the board actually have the authority and the power to make this policy?
Right.
One of them, here's the highest document possible in our hierarchy, right? It's the federal law.
Yeah. Yep.
So one of the examples I had recently, tell me if you've had anything similar to this, is a board was getting a bunch of complaints about flags. Over the 4th of July weekend, people putting flags out all over the place. And the board said, can we have a policy that disallows flags? Absolutely not. There's a U.S. federal law about everybody's ability and right to display the American flag.
Yeah, it's similar with elections, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Another good one.
Yep.
Political signs being out, and there's actually there's a window of time by state law that they are allowed to do it.
Yep.
Right. But one thing I like to tell a board though is you might not be able to disallow this particular thing, this example of flag. You might not be able to disallow something, but you can still regulate it as long as it doesn't infringe on the right.
Right.
So going back to the flag thing, so you might be able to say you can put it on your front door, but you can't put it on your balcony because then it might be going into a neighbor's, but whatever, right? But you create reasonable regulations that still allows people to have it, but just regulates it.
Yeah. I think the key word there is reasonable, right? Anytime you're considering creating a rule or changing a rule, you always want to make sure that you're erring on the side of reasonable.
Yes.
Because in a scenario where someone challenges that rule, that's the word that's going to be, that's going to keep coming up.
Subjective, right?
Yes. Yep. There is a little bit of gray area there, but you can construct your rules in such a way that it eliminates most of that gray area.
Yep.
But the key is to
So one of the ways that you can make it reasonable,
Yes.
and this goes to another point that I always like to drive home, is this rule that you're creating has to be universal to all in the community.
Yep.
It can't only apply to certain sections or certain subsections of the community. It needs to be uniformly applied. And then the next point that I always like to make, and then uniformly enforced.
Yes. That's a huge one.
Yes.
You can't single people out.
You've probably got lots of examples on this.
I do, yeah. A fairly common one is that I've run into, I don't know how common it would be for everyone, but is storage in garages.
Sure.
We had a particular unit that had an ongoing issue with their garage being full of things, and that made them park their vehicle outside of their garage, and said vehicle was in need of some maintenance,
Sure.
I'll put it lightly,
Uh-huh.
and leaked oil all over the place. So, in a scenario like that, it was easy to write the violation letter for, the garage being full of storage. However, it was not as easy to, approach the board and say, hey, there's at least 2 other units that
Sure.
we can see right now that have the same issue.
Right.
But no one's brought it up.
Yep.
So it's really, if you're enforcing it for one unit, you have to enforce it all the way across the board.
Absolutely.
Because you can't discriminate against a particular unit, and you got to treat everyone equal.
Perfect. Yeah. Another thing I like to talk about too with boards is can we actually enforce this?
Right.
So you can make a rule all day long.
Yep.
And when I say can, I don't mean do we have the power and the authority to. Do we actually have the means to enforce it?
Yeah.
Here's one example I always like to talk about: pet rules.
Yeah.
Right. Like
There was 1 and 2 I thought you were going to go
Yeah,
to.
pets
That's
and
one of
rentals.
them.
Pets
Yep.
and rentals are always the two. But here's one of the pet rules that I always like to work with boards on is, usually the declarations of the association says, the standard language of domestic pets are allowed, dogs and cats, subject to additional regulations that the board. Right. That's always like the kicker in the declarations. It kind of defers to the board to create additional policies.
It does, yes.
And that's where boards get into trouble.
Yep.
And here's an example of the pets that I like to talk about is what are the 2 most common restrictions that boards want to make? They either want to put a limit or they want to put some sort of weight restriction,
Yep.
size. Yeah.
Yep.
And I always like to tell the board, like, are you going to run around with a scale?
Yeah.
Okay, 50-pound dogs, well, maybe COVID wasn't kind to Fido either. And, maybe Fido really weighed 45 pounds, but maybe he's got a thyroid issue this year and he shot up to 55. Are you really going to tell? You're going to really tell Sally that Fido can't live here anymore because I just weighed him on your front step and he's at 55? I mean,
so that ties back into being reasonable, right? So that example nails 2 points, right? Is it reasonable? Which that's up for debate, right? And then also, how are you going to enforce it?
Yeah.
I mean, let's say you run into a scenario where someone has a 28-pound animal and your limit is 25 pounds. Right. What's your game plan there?
Right.
Are you going to ask the homeowner to remove the pet from their home? I mean, it's tough, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not going to, then why put that weight limit on?
Right. I've always just been very black and white with boards on this issue is don't create these additional restrictions that make it unenforceable for you.
Yeah.
So the other popular topic is rentals. So again, similar to pets, most declarations for most associations say that an owner has the right to rent or lease their unit.
Yeah. Yep.
Again, subject to additional restrictions that the boards
Right.
want to take. I've been a part of a number of lawsuits myself, actually, where boards interpreted that as, okay, well, we can't tell an owner that they can't, but we can make it really difficult for them to. And all of a sudden, the subjectivity piece comes in. And here's a specific example that I like to talk about is, one thing that a board might want to do is, and I've heard this countless times, is, okay, we can't tell them they can't rent, but let's tell them that they can't rent their unit unless they've lived there for a year. Now that's subjective, right? Is that a reasonable additional restriction, or does that infringe on their right? What's your opinion?
The problem is it's debatable.
Right.
So, I mean, my opinion there is kind of irrelevant, quite frankly. But I think the key is you want to avoid rules that are debatable.
Sure.
Right.
Go back to that point.
So you mentioned you were part of many lawsuits.
I've been a part of a handful of lawsuits on that
Exactly.
specific topic, and guess what? Every single time the board lost.
Yep. And even if you win, you're going to lose because lawyers aren't cheap.
That's a good point. That's a good point too. So I bring up that example though because it's a good example of what people think is a reasonable restriction, and it's not. But I bring that up because I always like to tell boards, like, if that really is a concern of yours about rentals, which is always a stigma, right? Which that's a different video.
Yep.
But so they want to disallow them, right? I always like to tell them, well, rather than amending your documents to disallow them, which is going to be tough to pass, amend your declarations to say that an owner can't rent their unit unless they've lived there for a year, because it eliminates the investor. It eliminates the investor buyers, which tend to be the ones that come with the stigma. But
Correct.
We're getting off on a little different topic there. But again, that's a good example of an additional restriction that they created that, as you said very well a couple of times, it's just unenforceable. It's debatable, and debatable means
bad. If it's in your rules and regulations.
Right.
So the time and place for that, for, requiring that an owner must own their unit for a year, is to amend your declaration.
Right.
Put it in the declaration.
Last thing I want to talk about when it comes to rules, I've always felt that if a board wants to bring up a topic, a particular issue, and they want to make rules, and you go through the things that we've just talked about. You can change parking restrictions. The declarations gives you the authority to do that. Okay, so we can talk about that. Yes, it's in the power of our scope to do. We did our research. Yes, we can uniformly enforce it. We did all those checkmark things that we talked about, and yes, we can create this rule about parking, and we can enforce it. Okay. Let's stop for a second, board. If you're really going to add to your rules and regulations, let's just look at the entire set of rules and regulations and make multiple changes. And bring them up to date to what you want. Because there's nothing more confusing to homeowners than, because you have to provide a copy of that new policy.
Absolutely.
So there's nothing more confusing to homeowners than after the January board meeting when they get a new parking restriction and we tell them, replace page 12 of your rules and regulations with this new page 12. And then 2 months later, you decide to tackle another topic and you do the same thing. And all of a sudden you've got
a scrapbook of rules and regulations is what you have.
A scrapbook. I love it. Yeah. So I guess that's another piece of advice. That the last thing I'll say about rules is that if you're considering a policy, back up and let's take a look at everything. And do we want to make multiple changes and just give everybody a new set that we know to this date this packet is accurate.
And I would say, digging into that revisions process a little bit more, being as clear and concise on your rules is very, very beneficial. You don't want to give people a novel. You want to make sure that A, you're not doubling up what's already written in your declaration.
Good point.
And B, you want to make it easy to digest, right? You don't want to hand it to someone and say, here's a 15-page document about what you can and cannot do at the association.
Sure.
Let's be honest, most people aren't going to read them. Right. If it's a one-page thing that they can put on their refrigerator, or even if it's just laying on their counter after they move in, they're way more apt to read that and get a concise overview of what their rules are. Versus sitting down with a cup of coffee and really going through a whole packet.
So Crime and Punishment or Atlas Shrugged is probably not. Okay. Well, so those are good examples of making sure you are able to apply this rule. Can you enforce it? Is it uniformly enforced? If you're going to look at one, maybe look at the whole thing. Make it concise. Rules are tricky for boards, but the more methodical you can be when you're creating them, the better, right?